The crimson sky of planet Zythor had not always looked like this. 300 years ago, when the colony elves first arrived, the sky was a soft violet blue, and the stars twinkled like gentle eyes watching over them. Lyra remembered those days clearly because her memory was one of the few things that had not failed her with age. While other elves grew tired and weak, their bodies breaking down under Zythor's strange gravity and radiation, Lyra's mind remained sharp and clear. It was her curse as much as her gift. She remembered everything, and the colony elders said that remembering the old world made her dangerous. They said she filled young elves' heads with stories of Earth that could never be reached, of green forests that no longer existed, of oceans that were now just memories in old records. The exile chamber had been cold and silent when they announced her banishment. Lyra stood before the council of 7 elders, her silver hair braided with the copper threads that marked her age and status. She had been a teacher once, respected and valued. She had trained 3 generations of colony children to read the ancient texts, to understand the engineering principles that kept their domed cities alive, to appreciate the value of knowledge passed down through millennia. But everything changed the day she found the dragon eggs. She had been exploring the forbidden western caves, the ones that the colony had sealed off decades ago, because something about them made the magnetic sensors go wild, and the radiation detectors scream warnings. Lyra had never been good at following orders she did not believe in, and she had always felt that secrets buried by the colony contained truths worth discovering. The cave system stretched deeper than any elf expected. The walls glowed with a faint bioluminescent moss that painted everything in soft shades of green and blue, and in the deepest chamber, in a nest made of what looked like meteorite rock and crystalline material, lay 2 eggs larger than her head. They were beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. The shells shimmered with colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle, deep purples bleeding into gold, then to emerald green. Lyra had spent 3 hours in that cave, just sitting and looking at the eggs, understanding on some fundamental level that she was witnessing something important, something that the colony leadership would declare dangerous and order destroyed. She had made her choice in those 3 hours. She took the eggs. She wrapped them in thermal mesh from her exploration suit and carried them back through the darkness, knowing that she had just committed an act of rebellion that would end her place in society. When the colony security found her returning to the city, they had arrested her immediately. The trial lasted less than an hour. The colony elders had already decided her fate. She had violated the forbidden exploration protocols. She had removed items of unknown origin from restricted areas. She had endangered the security of the entire colony. But most importantly, from the way they spoke with such venom in their voices, she had questioned their authority. They could not tolerate someone who would openly defy orders in pursuit of their own curiosity. The sentence was exile. She was given 1 survival suit, basic rations for 30 days, a compass, and a map of the nearest water sources. They left her at the edge of the colony dome, in the blasted rocky plain that stretched toward the mountains in the distance, and they sealed the airlock behind her. Lyra remembered standing there for a very long time, feeling the dust storm of Zythor wind push against her suit. She remembered looking back at the dome, at the lights glowing inside where hundreds of people continued their lives unaware that she was leaving forever. She remembered the exact moment when she chose not to break down, not to try to get back inside, not to beg for reconsideration. Instead, she had shifted the weight of her pack, made sure the eggs were secure against her body, where the suit's internal heating would keep them warm, and she had started walking toward the mountains. The ancient research facility had been a stroke of incredible fortune. It sat at the base of the mountains, a structure that predated the colony dome by at least a century. The colony records did not mention it, which meant it had been forgotten, abandoned, buried under years of dust storms and volcanic ash. But the doors still responded to the old access codes that Lyra had memorized from the historical texts. Inside, the facility was dark but still functional. The geothermal power cell had continued operating for all these years, patiently converting the heat beneath the planet's crust into electricity. Emergency lighting activated as soon as Lyra walked through the corridors. Climate control systems that had been dormant for decades hummed back to life. She had found a room with climate regulation chambers designed for transporting delicate biological specimens. It was almost as if the universe itself had prepared this place for her arrival. Lyra had carefully placed the dragon eggs inside one of the chambers and set the temperature controls to match what she guessed would be the egg's ideal environment. based on the composition of the nest materials and her understanding of biology. Then she had waited. She had explored the facility, learning what it had been. The records told her it was a research station, dedicated to studying Zythor's indigenous life before the colony arrival. It contained information about the planet that the current colony leadership had decided was either irrelevant or threatening. There were files about the dragons. The eggs she had found were not unique or rare. There had been hundreds of them once, thousands perhaps, long before the elves arrived. The dragons had been a thriving species on Zythor, intelligent and complex, with social structures and languages of their own. But the colony had cataloged them as dangerous predators and began a systematic elimination program that lasted 30 years. By the time the colony was fully established, the dragons were nearly extinct. Lyra learned that the eggs she had found were likely the last ones, the final survivors of a species being hunted to death by beings who had arrived from the stars and decided they owned everything they could see. The eggs had begun their process of hatching on a morning when 3 dust storms were happening, simultaneously in the valley below the facility. Lyra had heard the cracking sounds and run to the incubation chamber as fast as her aging legs could carry her. What emerged from the shells was beyond anything she had imagined. The creatures were no more than a meter long when they were born, but their eyes held an intelligence that made Lyra catch her breath. They looked at her with something beyond instinct, something that resembled curiosity and perhaps even gratitude. She had named the larger one Zephyr because his scales seemed to dance with the motion of wind, and he moved with a grace that defied his size even at that newborn stage. The smaller one she called Storm because her eyes sparked with amber light that reminded Lyra of lightning, and even as a hatchling, the female dragon moved with dangerous quickness and power. Those first months were the hardest. Lyra had no instruction manual for raising dragons. She had only the ancient texts and her instincts. She learned by trial and error what they ate, how they learned, what sounds they made, and what those sounds meant. She discovered that the dragons communicated through a combination of physical gestures, vocalizations that ranged from subsonic rumbles to high-pitched chirps, and something else that she could only describe as mental impressions that appeared in her mind like half-remembered dreams. The facility had contained food stores that had been sealed for preservation. Lyra synthesized fresh meat from the nutrient-based materials and taught the dragons to eat. She found educational materials in the archives and used them to understand dragon physiology and behavior. She spent every moment of every day learning alongside her dragons, and in doing so, she began to understand something profound. The dragons were not wild beasts. They were not the monsters that the colony had decided to eliminate. They were people, not human people, but people nonetheless. They had thoughts and feelings and personalities. Zephyr was curious and careful, always considering his actions before taking them. Storm was impulsive and bold, always wanting to test her limits and push herself further. As they grew, Lyra began training them. She taught them to hunt in the valleys beyond the facility, carefully choosing prey that would not alert the colony to their presence. She taught them to recognize her commands and respond to her voice. But more importantly, she taught them to trust her, and through that trust, something extraordinary developed between them. A bond, a connection that went beyond the simple relationship between a creature and its trainer. They became a family, the only family any of them had. 3 beings of different species, different origins, different biologies, choosing to exist together in the wilderness of an alien world. Years passed. Lyra aged further, her movements becoming slower, her strength diminishing. But her mind remained active and sharp. The dragons grew to magnificent sizes. Zephyr became powerful and strong, his scales hardening into armor that could resist most threats. Storm developed incredible speed and agility, her intelligence finding creative solutions to problems. Neither of them looked fully like the historical images of dragons that Lyra had found in the archives. They were adapted to Zythor, evolved by the planet itself into something new, something that should not exist but did. Lyra had accepted that she would die in this facility. The arrival of the Krell ships was something that nobody was prepared for. The colony had been isolated from the greater universe for so long that most elves had begun to believe they were alone in existence. The old records spoke of space travel in distant worlds and great civilizations, but those were stories to most of the younger generation, myths about a past that seemed irrelevant to daily survival on Zythor. The colony had enough to worry about with managing the dome systems, mining resources from the planet, and maintaining the careful ecological balance within their sealed walls. When the sensors detected the ships, the colony's response was cautious confusion. Council leader Marcus, the eldest of the council at this time, convened an emergency session. They tried to make radio contact with the arriving vessels. They sent signals in mathematical sequences, the universal language that any technological civilization might understand. They offered greetings and peaceful intentions. They received no response except for the steady approach of the massive metal structures descending through Zythor's atmosphere. There were 5 ships, each one large enough to cast a shadow that stretched for kilometers when they positioned themselves above the colony. The Krell machines did not attempt communication. They simply began to descend lower, their sensors sweeping across the landscape. Lyra felt the tremors from where she stood in the facility, watching through the ancient view screens that still functioned after all these years. She knew that everything was about to change. She could feel it in the way her dragons grew restless, the way they moved through the corridors with agitation and concern. The first attack came when 3 of the Krell ships launched assault mechs toward the colony dome. The mechanical constructs were enormous, towering structures of metal and electronics that moved on powerful hydraulic legs. They were armed with weapons that fired energy beams and projectiles that could punch through reinforced walls like paper. The colony's defensive systems, designed for dealing with natural disasters and potential internal conflicts, were completely inadequate against this kind of assault. Lyra watched the destruction through the facility's sensor array. She saw the colony dome's outer walls crack under the onslaught. She saw explosions flowering across the colony's agricultural sectors. She saw hundreds of elves running through the streets in panic, searching for safety that did not exist. Some tried to fight back with whatever weapons they could find, but it was like insects attacking a walking building. The weapons could not penetrate the Krell armor. The soldiers could not move fast enough to evade the assault mechs. Within the first hour, the colony's primary dome was completely compromised. The pressure seals began to fail. Emergency bulkheads attempted to seal off the damaged sections, but there were too many breaches, too much devastation. Lyra understood immediately what would happen. The colony was going to collapse. The 1,000 elves who had called her useless, who had decided that her life was not worth preserving, would die in the coming hours unless something dramatic changed. Some of them might escape the dome and survive temporarily in the wilderness, but without the colony's resources and technology, they would not last long. Zythor was a harsh world that did not tolerate weakness or poor preparation. The desert could kill you in a matter of hours if you were not equipped for it. She looked at Zephyr and Storm, who had been pacing the facility corridors with growing agitation. The dragons seemed to understand that something terrible was happening beyond their mountain sanctuary. Their eyes reflected the light of the distant explosions. Their breathing had become fast and shallow, signs of stress and readiness that Lyra had learned to recognize years ago. She made a decision in that moment that would have seemed insane to anyone else, and probably insane to herself if she had stopped to think about it logically. She had spent decades teaching her dragons to hunt prey, to survive in the wilderness, to be strong and independent. She had taught them because survival was what mattered on Zythor, and she wanted them to be able to live when she was gone. But she had also taught them other things without fully realizing it. She had taught them about loyalty and choices and the meaning of family. She had shown them through her own actions that sometimes you had to stand with others even when it was dangerous, even when it would have been easier to hide away and let the world take care of itself. Lyra placed her weathered hands on both dragons' heads, one on Zephyr's scaled skull and one on Storm's. She felt the familiar sensation of their minds opening to hers, the strange connection that had developed between them over all these years. She showed them through that mental contact what was happening to the colony. She showed them the elves fleeing through burning streets, children crying, adults fighting hopeless battles against machines they could not understand. She showed them the suffering and the fear. Then she asked them a question that she had never asked before. She asked if they would help her. She asked if they would fight alongside her, not to protect themselves, but to protect a species that had once hunted their kind to near extinction. She asked them to choose mercy and courage over revenge and isolation. Zephyr's response came first, a wave of determination and loyalty that made Lyra feel almost dizzy. The massive dragon rumbled a sound that came from deep in his chest, a sound that meant yes and also meant I will always follow where you lead. Storm responded with a complex series of mental images that showed the two of them standing side by side with Lyra. facing down the metal constructs using every skill and ability they possessed. They emerged from the facility into the night air, and the wind of Zythor caught their scales and wings. Zephyr had a wingspan of nearly 30 meters, and Storm's was almost as large. In the reflected light of the burning colony dome in the distance, they looked like creatures from the nightmares and legends of ancient peoples. They looked like hope or they looked like death, depending on which side of the conflict you were standing on. The nearest Krell mech detected them almost immediately. The machine turned its massive body to face this new threat, its sensors trying to classify these biological entities that had suddenly appeared on the mountain ridge. Lyra felt Zephyr's muscles tense beneath her, felt the dragon preparing to launch himself into the air. She leaned forward against the warm scales and whispered words of encouragement that she was not even sure the dragon could hear over the wind in the distance. They flew toward the colony, at a speed that Lyra had not known Zephyr was capable of. The air rushed past her face, cold and harsh, and she gripped the dragon's neck as tightly as she could. Behind them, Storm flew in a perfect parallel pattern, her movements precise and controlled. The two dragons flew like they were born to do this, like they had trained their entire lives for this single moment. The Krell mech tried to track them with its weapon systems, but the dragons were too fast, too unpredictable. They did not move like the flying aircraft that the Krell war machines had been programmed to expect. They moved like living creatures with intuition and instinct, guiding their flight patterns. Zephyr dove and twisted through the air while Storm approached from a different angle. They were coordinating their attack without any command from Lyra, working together as a perfect team that had been forged through years of cooperation. Zephyr released his first breath attack when he was close enough that the Krell mech could not evade. The dragon's fire was not like ordinary fire. It was a plasma of exotic matter that Lyra still did not fully understand, something that seemed to burn at temperatures that made the very air shimmer and distort. The Krell's armor could withstand many things, but this was beyond its specifications. The metal began to glow and then to melt. Sections of the machine's hull simply ceased to exist, consumed by the intense heat. Storm came in as the machine tried to recover from the first attack. The smaller dragon's speed allowed her to dart beneath the mech's defensive weapons and strike at its structural support. Her claws were not just strong. They were sharp in a way that suggested some kind of molecular structure that Lyra had never fully understood. The dragon tore through hydraulic lines and power conduits like they were made of paper. The Krell mech crashed to the ground, its legs no longer responding to its programming. Its weapon system sparked and went silent. The first machine had been defeated, but there were more coming. Even as Lyra watched, two additional assault mechs emerged from the colony's ruined dome and began making their way toward the mountain where she and the dragons stood. The night was coming alive with the sounds of war, with screams and explosions and the mechanical grinding of massive machines. The elves in the colony dome were seeing something now that they had never expected to see. They were seeing hope. They were seeing creatures that they had been taught, where wild beasts stand up and fight against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Lyra pointed toward the approaching machines and felt Zephyr understand without words what needed to be done. The dragons launched themselves back into the air, ready for the next battle, ready to show the Krell that they had made a terrible mistake coming to Zythor. They had expected to find a colony of weak beings easy to conquer. They had not expected to find dragons. The second night of the invasion became a turning point that nobody could have predicted. As Zephyr and Storm continued their assault on the Krell assault mechs, something changed in the colony's response. The elves had been fleeing in chaos and despair, but now they were watching something that restored a tiny spark of hope to their hearts. They were watching someone they thought was useless, someone they had exiled and abandoned, stand against an impossible enemy with two creatures that should not even exist. Lyra fought with a precision and grace that belied her age and exhaustion. She had spent centuries studying the martial techniques of the ancient elves, warriors who had fought in wars long before the colony was ever established. She had trained herself physically despite her aging body, because she believed that knowledge without practical application was just history, and history was best learned through living and doing rather than reading. Now all of that preparation served a purpose she had never fully anticipated. When Zephyr and Storm cleared the way through the Krell defenses, Lyra would dismount and move through the mechanical debris on foot, using her knowledge of machinery and engineering to sabotage the damaged mechs further. She knew exactly where to strike to collapse a support beam, how to overload a power system, which connections to sever to disable entire weapon systems. The elder machines that the Krell had deployed were advanced, but they were also designed by creatures very different from elves. They did not anticipate the kind of precise, methodical thinking that Lyra brought to her work. By the dawn of the third day, 5 Krell assault mechs had been destroyed, and another 4 were severely damaged. The orbital ships had stopped sending reinforcements. Instead, they began launching ground-based weapons directly from space, targeting specific areas of the colony. Lyra understood that the Krell were adapting their strategy. They had not expected resistance of this caliber, and now they were adjusting to the presence of the dragons. The problem was that the orbital weapons could destroy far more area than the dragons could protect. If the Krell decided to simply glass the entire continent from above, there was nothing that Lyra and her dragons could do to stop them. She had achieved something incredible, proving that the Krell were not invincible. But the fundamental reality was that the aliens had the advantage of space supremacy. The colony could not compete with that level of technological advantage. It was Marcus who came to her. The colony's leader had survived the initial attacks by staying in the reinforced command bunker beneath the dome. When the fighting moved away from the colony's central structures, he had ventured out into the ruins to find Lyra. She was sitting in the lee of a destroyed Krell mech, her body aching with a pain that made every breath a careful calculation. Zephyr and Storm were resting nearby, their scales still glowing faintly from the heat of their recent battle. Marcus looked at her with an expression that was a complex mixture of emotions. There was gratitude, yes, but also shame and something that might have been regret. He was an old elf himself, older than Lyra by nearly 100 years, and he carried the weight of leadership and decision-making that had aged him beyond even his considerable years. He said to her that the colony was grateful for what she had done. He said that her exile had been wrong, that the decision to banish her had been made in fear and ignorance. He said that he had voted for her removal, and he had done so believing that he was protecting the colony's future. Now he could see that he had been wrong in ways that he was still trying to fully comprehend. Lyra listened without responding immediately. She was watching Zephyr and Storm, the way they lay close together, the way their breathing synchronized even in sleep. She was thinking about all the ways that fear could shape the decisions of people in power, how not understanding something could make you want to destroy it rather than learn about it. She told Marcus that his apology was accepted, but it was not what the colony needed. The colony needed to survive the current invasion, and survival was going to require them to make choices that would have seemed impossible just days ago. She told him that she had a plan, but it was dangerous and it would require him to trust her completely. Marcus listened as Lyra explained her strategy. She had studied the Krell weapon systems during the battles, had analyzed the patterns and learned the frequency signatures of their scanners and communication systems. She had used the ancient facility's computers to crack the basic encryption protocols. It was not perfect, but it was enough. She believed she could create a transmission that would make the Krell think that other Krell ships were approaching, that their military advantage was about to be significantly reduced. It would force them to make a decision. Either they would retreat to investigate the signal, or they would commit more heavily to their invasion, attempting to finish their objectives before they could be challenged. Lyra told Marcus that if the Krell chose to commit more heavily, the colony's best chance would be a full evacuation and guerrilla resistance. She had supplies hidden at the ancient facility. She had knowledge of the planet that the colony had lost or abandoned. If necessary, she could lead the survivors into the mountains and help them survive long enough that the Krell might decide the colony was too much trouble to maintain their occupation. But she also told Marcus that if he was willing to do something more aggressive, something that would probably seem crazy to most of his people, there might be a way to completely drive the Krell from Zythor. The colony had old weapons in the archives, technology that predated even the ancient facility. Most of it was non-functional, but some of it might be salvageable. And there was another advantage that the colony had not considered. They had dragons now. Whether they wanted them or not, whether they accepted the reality or not, they had dragons fighting alongside them. Marcus made his decision. He told Lyra to do whatever she needed to do. He would begin gathering the colony's survivors and organizing them for whatever came next. Over the next 24 hours, Lyra worked at a pace that would have been impossible for someone her age under normal circumstances. But necessity was a powerful motivator. and she was not about to waste the opportunity that she had been given. She worked with a team of engineers and technicians that Marcus selected, people who were young and strong enough to help her operate the ancient facility. They brought the facility's main computer system fully online for the first time in over a century. They began reactivating old weapons systems and running diagnostics on technology that had been in dormancy for longer than most of the colony's inhabitants had been alive. The transmission that Lyra created was a masterpiece of deception. Using the Krell language that she had partially decoded from their communications, she crafted a signal that would appear to come from a distant Krell fleet. She made it indicate that reinforcements were being sent, that the colony invasion was being recalled as a priority, and that Krell Command wanted the current invasion force to hold position and maintain the captured territory. It was the kind of gamble that could fail spectacularly. The Krell might see through the deception immediately, or they might become more aggressive in response. But it was the best option available to them. When Lyra sent the signal, the response came within minutes. The orbital ships changed their attack patterns. Their weapons stopped hitting the colony structures at random and began concentrating on specific military targets. The assault mechs regrouped and established defensive positions rather than continuing their advance. For the first time since the Krell arrival, it seemed like the invaders were uncertain, like they were reconsidering their strategy. Lyra took this window of opportunity and acted. She brought Zephyr and Storm to the reinforced weapons platform that her team had managed to activate. The Dragon's plasma fire, when combined with the ancient facility's particle acceleration weapons, created something devastating. Lyra coordinated the attack personally, riding Zephyr while Storm provided aerial support and reconnaissance. They targeted the Krell ships with precision and power that made the machine seem almost primitive by comparison. The orbital vessels, designed for combat against other spacecraft, were not prepared to defend against an enemy that could operate at ground level and still threaten their hulls. One of the 5 ships took critical damage. Its shields failed under the sustained assault, and once the shields were down, the old weapons and the Dragon's attacks worked in perfect coordination. The ship exploded in a burst of light and shattered metal, its debris raining down across the landscape. The remaining 4 Krell ships launched a full retreat, activating their hyperspace engines and jumping away from the planet. The assault mechs, without support from the orbital weapons, became easy targets for the Dragons and the colony's forces working together. Within 2 hours, the Krell invasion had ended. The silence that followed the Krell retreat was almost as overwhelming as the noise of battle had been. The colony survivors emerged from the bunkers and shelters where they had hidden, looking around at the ruins of their former home. The dome that had protected them for generations was largely destroyed. The agricultural sectors had been burned. The water processing facilities had been damaged. Almost everything that the colony needed to sustain itself had been either destroyed or severely compromised. And yet the survivors stood and looked at the wreckage and realized that they were alive. Against all odds, against an enemy that seemed invincible, they had survived. Lyra stood on the highest point of the ruined dome with Zephyr and Storm beside her. Her body was screaming with exhaustion and pain. The wounds she had sustained during the battle were numerous and deep. Her hands were cut and burned from handling the weapons and machinery. Her mind felt foggy, as if she had used up some essential resource and could not quite get it back. But even through the exhaustion and pain, she felt something else. She felt a sense of completion, as if she had finally done what she was meant to do. Marcus approached her slowly, carefully. He seemed to be moving through some kind of emotional haze, trying to process everything that had happened. The man who had voted for her exile was now looking at her with an expression that mixed shame and awe, and something that might have been profound admiration. He said that the colony owed her their lives. He said that he had been wrong about her, that all of the council had been wrong. He asked her what the colony could do to repay such a debt. He offered her a position of honor, restoration of her status, anything that she might want. Lyra looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She told him that she did not need position or status. She had found what she needed when the colony exiled her. She had found purpose and meaning and family. What she wanted, what the colony needed to do if they truly understood what had happened here, was to change how they thought about the unknown, to change how they treated those who questioned authority or explored the forbidden, to change how they responded to things they did not understand. She told Marcus that there were dragons on Zythor now, or at least there would be again if he allowed it. Zephyr and Storm were not alone in their desire to survive. The ancient facility contained records of the original dragon population and where they had lived on the planet. Some might still exist in the deeper caves, hiding from elf hunters. Some eggs might still be waiting for someone to find them and care for them. If the colony was serious about atonement and about building a better future, then they would establish sanctuaries for the dragons. They would protect them rather than hunt them. More than that, Lyra said, the colony needed to reach out to the universe. They needed to try to contact other civilizations and create alliances and mutual protection agreements. Isolation had nearly destroyed them. The only reason they survived was because one person had found creatures powerful enough to defend against the Krell. But that could not be the colony's long-term strategy. They needed to be part of something larger. Marcus listened carefully, and Lyra could see that he was genuinely considering what she was saying. The old council leader had seen enough in the past few days to make him understand that everything he thought he knew about the world needed to be reconsidered. He asked if she would help lead this new vision of the colony. He asked if she would stay and work with the survivors to rebuild not just the physical structures, but the entire society. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at Zephyr and Storm, feeling their minds through the bond that connected them. She asked them silently if they wanted to stay, if they wanted to help shape the colony's future. Their answer came as a wave of acceptance and loyalty. They had fought for the colony not out of obligation, but out of choice. They were willing to continue making that choice. Lyra told Marcus that she would help, but with conditions. The dragons would be treated as partners and citizens, not as servants or weapons. The colony's people would be educated about the dragons, and the dragons would be given the freedom to come and go as they pleased. And most importantly, the decisions about the colony's future would be made collectively, with all voices heard and considered, not just the Council of Elders. Marcus agreed to all of her terms. It was a significant change for a colony that had always been governed by a small group of elders who made decisions for everyone else. But Marcus had learned something during the invasion that he had never fully understood before. When people were forced to rely on someone from the margins of society, someone they had rejected and dismissed, they began to see the value in perspectives that they had previously ignored. Over the following weeks, the colony began its transformation. Lyra worked with the engineering teams to assess the damage and plan the reconstruction. Some parts of the old dome could not be salvaged, so she proposed building new structures that were less centralized and more distributed. She suggested hybrid designs that incorporated some of the old elf technology but also used dragon-friendly architecture that Zephyr and Storm could help develop. The process of teaching the colony about dragons was slow and challenging. Many elves had grown up hearing stories about dragons as monsters, as threats to be eliminated. Changing those narratives required time and patience and repeated interactions. But Lyra was patient. She had spent decades alone with Zephyr and Storm, learning them. She was willing to spend whatever time was necessary to help other elves learn as well. She organized gatherings where the dragons would interact with people in controlled situations. She showed how Zephyr could be gentle and careful despite his enormous size. She demonstrated how Storm could learn complex commands and follow instructions while still retaining her independence and personality. She told stories of the dragon's history on Zythor, of a species that had thrived before the colony arrived, of a tragedy that had nearly resulted in extinction. Gradually, the colony's fear began to transform into curiosity, and then into something approaching respect. Young elves who had been terrified of the dragons began to approach them with wonder. Some even began learning to communicate with them, developing their own bond similar to the one that Lyra had with Zephyr and Storm. The search for other surviving dragons began in earnest. Teams equipped with the best equipment the colony could provide ventured into the deeper caves of Zythor. They found 3 eggs in a cave system west of the colony. They found evidence of adult dragons living in the volcanic regions further south. Word began to spread that the dragons were coming back, that the species that had almost been destroyed might actually survive and thrive again. But there was also conflict and resistance. Some of the older council members and traditionalists argued that the colony was losing its way, that they should focus on rebuilding their civilization rather than wasting resources on dragons and exploration. There were debates and arguments and moments when it seemed like the fragile unity that had developed during the crisis might shatter. Lyra had to make difficult decisions about how much to push for change and how much to allow the natural processes of social transformation to happen at their own pace. She worked with Marcus to navigate the political challenges, always careful not to simply impose her will, but instead to help people understand the reasons behind the changes. One evening, standing on the new platform that had been built as a meeting place for the community, Lyra addressed the entire colony. She spoke about the choices that people make when they face difficult situations. She told them that she had been called useless, that she had been exiled by the same people who were now asking her for guidance. She said that she did not bring this up to shame them or to demand apologies. She brought it up because it illustrated an important truth. Every person had value. Every being had something to contribute. Sometimes you had to look beyond what was immediately obvious or conventionally accepted to see that value. She told them that the Krell invasion had not been some random act of cosmic chance. It was a consequence of the colony's isolation and the choices they had made as a society. If they had been more open to exploration, if they had been more willing to learn about the wider universe, they might have seen the danger coming and prepared differently. And if Lyra had been allowed to continue her forbidden explorations instead of being exiled, she might have found the dragons earlier, and the colony might have had more time to establish an alliance that could have prevented the invasion entirely. The people listened carefully. They understood that Lyra was not just speaking about history, but about the future they were about to build together. 1 year after the Krell invasion, the colony of Zethor had been transformed into something that nobody could have imagined during those dark days of invasion and survival. The rubble of the old dome had been cleared and repurposed. New structures rose from the ground, built with architecture that combined the best of old elf engineering with innovations that had come from studying dragons and how they lived in their natural environments. Open-air platforms provided places where humans and dragons could interact and work together. Gardens grew not just in carefully controlled sectors, but throughout the settlement, creating green spaces that made the colony feel more like a living ecosystem rather than a sealed artificial bubble. Lyra walked through the colony with Zephyr and Storm beside her, as she did most afternoons. The sight that had once terrified the citizens, an old elf woman walking freely with 2 massive dragons, now seemed almost normal. Children played in the streets without fear, running between the dragon's legs and laughing when Zephyr lowered his head to let them pet his scales. Adults went about their work with a confidence that came from knowing that their new protectors were always nearby. The discovery of other dragons had been even more successful than anyone had hoped. The teams that ventured into the caves had found 6 adult dragons in addition to the eggs. Most of them had been wild and suspicious of the elves at first, but over time and with careful training and respect, shown to them as intelligent beings, several had agreed to work with the colony as partners rather than as servants. The species was slowly recovering from the brink of extinction. Lyra had not expected to become a teacher again, but that was essentially what had happened. She led training sessions for young elves who wanted to learn about dragon behavior and communication. She worked with the dragons to help them understand how to coexist with the colony in mutually beneficial ways. She consulted on the design of the new settlement structures, making sure that the architecture served both elf and dragon needs. The messages that the colony had begun sending out into the universe had received several responses. There were other civilizations out there, some hostile and some peaceful. The colony had begun establishing trade relationships and information exchanges with peaceful neighbors. They had also received a warning about the Krell from a civilization called the Vareth that lived several star systems away. The Krell were known to be systematic and aggressive, but they were also susceptible to strong opposition. If an enemy could demonstrate that resistance was too costly, the Krell would often move on to softer targets. Marcus had been planning to step down from his position as colony leader for several months, and recently he had finally made that announcement to the community. The colony's first truly democratic election was scheduled to happen in a few weeks. Lyra had been asked by several people if she would consider running for the position, but she had declined. She believed the colony needed a younger leader, someone who had grown up with more openness and flexibility than even Marcus possessed. Besides, she had other work to do. In her personal quarters at the ancient facility, which she still used as her home and workspace, Lyra was working on a project that she had not yet shared with many people. She was writing a comprehensive history of Zethor, as she had come to understand it through the research in the ancient archives and through her own years of experience. She was documenting the original dragon species, their culture, and their language, as much as she could reconstruct it. She was creating a record of the colony's development and transformation, making sure that future generations would understand both how far they had come and how much further they could still go. Zephyr often kept her company during these writing sessions, his massive head resting near her workspace. Storm preferred to spend time flying over the mountains and valleys, exploring the territory that she had once lived in with Lyra, but now could traverse freely. The bond between Lyra and her dragons had not diminished over the year. If anything, it had grown deeper and more complex. They understood each other in ways that transcended simple communication. One evening, as Lyra was working late on her historical records, Zephyr suddenly lifted his head and made a low rumbling sound that Lyra had learned meant something significant was happening. Through their mental bond, she felt the dragon's awareness of something approaching from the sky. A ship, but not a Krell ship. This vessel was different, smaller, and more elegant in design. It was broadcasting identification signals that Lyra's computer systems immediately analyzed and translated. It was a scientific vessel, belonging to the Vareth civilization that had warned them. About the Krell, the ship was requesting permission to land and to establish communications with the colony's leadership. Lyra immediately contacted Marcus and informed him of the arrival. The former colony leader had been expecting this visit. The Vareth had expressed interest in learning more about the colony and about the dragons. The meeting that took place in the Great Hall that had been built specifically for diplomatic gatherings was one that would be remembered in the colony's history for generations to come. The Vareth delegation consisted of 3 tall beings with skin that shimmered like oil on water, and eyes that seemed to perceive multiple spectrums of light simultaneously. They were accompanied by several of their own military personnel, though they kept these soldiers in the background, trying not to be threatening. The Vareth scientists were fascinated by the dragons. They had instruments that could analyze Zephyr and Storm at a level of detail that revealed biological structures and chemical processes that even Lyra's research had only speculated about. They were particularly interested in learning about the bond between the dragons and the elves, something that they said did not exist in any form in their own experience. The lead Vareth scientist, whose name Lyra pronounced as something close to synthesis in motion, explained that the Vareth had observed the colony's transformation with great interest. Most species that encountered the Krell either were destroyed or spent decades in recovery, trying to rebuild what had been lost. The colony of Zethor had not only survived, but had fundamentally transformed itself in positive ways, establishing new relationships and finding new sources of strength in the process. Synthesis in motion told Lyra that the Vareth were impressed by her role in this transformation. They wanted to propose an alliance, a formal agreement that would bind the colony to Vareth protection and support in exchange for knowledge and access to some of the colony's unique resources, including information about the dragons. The Vareth were particularly interested in understanding the biological mechanisms behind the dragon-elf bond, as this could potentially lead to applications beneficial to both species. Lyra listened carefully to the proposal, but she did not commit to anything immediately. She explained to Synthesis in Motion that the decision needed to be made by the colony as a whole, not by her alone. She had learned from her exile and from her subsequent work rebuilding the community that autocratic decisions by individuals or small groups often led to injustice and poor outcomes. The colony had created a more democratic system, and any major decision about alliances with other civilizations needed to go through that process. She offered to arrange a more formal presentation where Synthesis in Motion could address the entire colony leadership and the citizens, allowing people to ask questions and understand what such an alliance would mean for their future. The Vareth agreed to this arrangement, seeming to respect Lyra's commitment to the democratic process. Over the following weeks, the debate in the colony was extensive and thoughtful. Some people were enthusiastic about the Vareth alliance, seeing it as an opportunity for the colony to connect with a larger community and to access advanced technology and knowledge. Others were more cautious, worried about becoming dependent on another civilization or losing their independence and identity. but the debate was conducted with a level of civility and intellectual rigor that would have been impossible in the colony's earlier days when decisions were made by decree of the elders. In the end, the colony voted to accept the Vareth alliance, but with conditions. The colony would maintain autonomy over their own internal affairs. The dragons would be recognized as full citizens with all the rights and protections that entailed. The colony would continue their exploration and education programs without Vareth interference. And most importantly, knowledge that might be dangerous to the balance of power in the region would be shared carefully, and only after careful consideration of the consequences. Synthesis in Motion agreed to all of the conditions. As the Vareth vessel prepared to leave Zethor, carrying with them data and recordings about the dragons and the colony's transformation, Lyra stood watching with Zephyr and Storm beside her. The dragon's scales glowed with the reflected light of the descending sun, painting them in shades of gold and crimson. Lyra thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the exile that she had endured, the loneliness and the uncertainty, the years spent in the abandoned facility with 2 dragon eggs. She thought about the choice she had made to fight for people who had rejected her, and how that choice had ultimately led to this new future, where dragons and elves worked together as